Thank you. Commissioner Mimica, Mario Calderini, my friend Roberto Ridolfi, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is for me an honor and a pleasure to be with you today to deliver this Kapuscinski Development Series lecture. I want to thank the organizers, the Alta Scuola Politecnica, the European Commission, particularly the Directorate for Sustainable Growth and Development, and of course the UNDP. Usually, I would prefer to stand up next to a podium because I feel when I'm on my feet, I'm more in command than when I'm sitting down. So let's see if I can, while sitting down, still generate the passion and the excitement in speaking about what is so dear to me. Richard Kapuscinski shone a light on the social inequality that so often lies at the root of conflict. If he were alive with us today, I'm sure he would be documenting and writing about the plight of thousands of migrants and refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, Congo, Eritrea, Mali, and even my own homeland of Nigeria. Migrants and refugees who risk everything they have, including their lives, in order to seek safety and security in Europe. The Somali-born, British-raised poet, Wassan Shire, captures it in the following words, I quote, "You have to understand, no one puts their child in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." That is very telling. On just one day last week, 2,000 migrants arrived by boat in Italy. And every day, an estimated 7,000 children, women, and men arrive in Greece by sea. And on the other side of the world, in the Bay of Bengal and elsewhere in Asia and the Americas, similar scenes of desperation are being played out. What causes people to migrate? Conflict, yes, but also hunger, poverty, injustice, inequality, persistent indignity, and the lack of opportunity. This is why Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals, which was endorsed last month by member states of the United Nations, is so important to us, because it aims to address the root cause, or the root causes of the despair, the desperation, and the conflict that compel people to leave their homelands, to leave everything behind them. The agenda has set a 15-year target, a timeline to eliminate poverty, inequality, hunger, and undernutrition, and also to tackle the impact of climate change. Now, this may seem an overly ambitious goal, but the point is that we no longer have the luxury of setting the modest goals with longer horizons, 25 to 50 years. But can this ambitious agenda be done? My answer is, why not? We have already reduced the number of people living in extreme poverty by 1 billion. We have also met the target of halving the poverty rate. We did it 5 years ahead of schedule in the year 2010. And in the last 15 years, the proportion of undernourished people in the developing world has fallen by almost half to 795 million. If we did all of this 15 years, in 15 years. Now, with technology, IT, and the generosity and the ambition of member states, why can we not do this, achieve this goal of the SDGs by 2030? But to achieve this goal, this rather ambitious new agenda, it will require commitment to both developing and transforming the rural areas of developing countries. Not only developing them, but also transforming them, but particularly not just in developing countries, but in rural areas. But why this? Why this specificity? Very simple. Poverty and hunger are most rampant in the developing world, 75%. And 80% of the poor in developing countries live in rural areas. It's a very simple math. Because it is in the rural areas of the developing world that the impact of climate change is being most dramatically felt. And because with the world population rising from 7.4 billion today to 9.7 billion by 2050, it's no longer 9.1, it's now 9.7 billion projected by 2050. We will need rural areas to do a few things for us. One, they have to grow our food, because food grows in rural areas, not in cities and capitals. They have to maintain clean water and air. Clean water comes from rural areas, from the mountains, not from skyscrapers in capital cities. And they provide jobs. Why jobs? Because agriculture in the developing world provides 80 to 90% of employment in some countries. And so, for our growing population, without a transformation of the rural areas, we cannot achieve the SDGs. Now, why do I speak about rural transformation, not just rural development? Well, rural transformation means the type of smallholder-led development that has produced massive agricultural gains in Brazil, in China, and in Vietnam. It has been done elsewhere. So it can be done also in Africa and in South Asia. But it involves development that is centered on one simple thing: people. And it means investing in people. This is very key, and I will explain why I say people and why I say investing. I mean investing in change that is social as well as economic, so that rural areas are socially viable and economically vibrant. Socially viable and economically vibrant. They go hand in hand together. I mean investing in change that is comprehensive and inclusive in nature, and it has lasting impact. The benefits of rural transformation reach far and wide. All of us will benefit when there is a flow of goods, of services, of money, and information between rural and urban areas. All of us benefit from healthy food, from clean water, and fresh air. Now, rural areas today are home to 3 billion people, almost half of our human race today. But they are scattered across vast distances, in remote areas, usually out of the sight of the world's political leaders and media centers. And too often, basic services that we take for granted, such as paved roads, schools, healthcare, even internet connection, do not reach them. Why? Because they are far from sight. They are voiceless. They are invisible. And oftentimes, they are forgotten. For IFAD, today, the gap between the rich and the poor is simply a gap between the urban and the rural. But we believe it is time to narrow that gap. Why do we say it is time? In fact, for me, it is past time, because we have no alternative. As was said earlier by my friend Roberto, we all live in the urban-rural nexus on which our food, our health, and our future depends. Development of our rural areas benefits all of us. So I believe it is time to do away with the urban-rural dichotomy and to recognize that we will succeed or we will fail. We will survive or we will perish together. But just look at what is already happening. Span the horizon across the world. What do we have? Massive migration from rural into urban areas. The consequence is bulging urban slums and ghettos. Restive youth now living in the breeding grounds of extremism. And of course, we have a consequent destabilization of societies. Ladies and gentlemen, let me take some time before I go about rural transformation and how to finance it. I want to make sure that we are all clear on one point. What I'm talking about today is not aid, is not handouts. I'm talking about development. As I said, development means investment, particularly investment in people. We have to reorientate our thinking. We have to change our mindset. When we put electrification in a village, or we build a road across villages, when we provide health services, these are not showcases for government. We must see them as investment in people, not investment by political leaders for the next vote. It must be people-centered. That is the difference between investment in development and aid or handouts. But oftentimes, aid is an emergency. It's an emergency response to an emergency situation, and we have plenty of them today. It is the money that is needed in the aftermath of an earthquake, a volcano, or a tsunami. It is what migrants need when they arrive in a new country with nothing but their shirt, the only shirt they have on their backs. Now, without aid, such people would die. But that is aid. It's short-term. It is essential at times of crisis. But it is just like Band-Aid, short-term. But development is a long-term investment. An investment to change conditions on the ground so that people have what they need to build their own lives by themselves. So they can invest in their own businesses. They can raise their children at home. Development creates the condition for people to be more resilient when disaster strikes. It addresses inequality. It addresses indignity. It addresses the lack of opportunity. So often force people to cross deserts and oceans in search of better lives and livelihoods. And when you invest in people, you are expecting a dividend. When you give aid, you are expecting thanks. But when you invest in people, you are expecting a dividend, because every investment must give you a dividend. And the dividend out of investment is development. Development is not a short-term fix. It takes patience, it takes perseverance, it takes persistence. It requires the investment of time, effort, and money, day after day, week after week, year after year. It's not a 2-year project. It must take time for the roots of change before the roots of change are fixed in the soil, until every plant, every tree, every crop, until it is fully rooted in its own soil, it cannot develop. It cannot develop. And so we need the patience and the time to invest in people for them to stand on their feet. Because development is an intrinsic process. It is endogenous. It is not something that you can introduce from outside. So it must begin from inside and then manifest itself phenotypically for those of you students of biology, and you see it blossom. So it must be embedded in processes that are driven by government, in local policies, and in overall commitment from the highest political levels of government, from local authorities to community organizations. But most importantly, it must be owned by the government and by the people, not introduced from outside. It must address people's welfare and well-being, particularly of the most vulnerable, of children, of women, the most marginalized, who live in rural areas of the developing world, where, as I said, poverty is most stubborn, in South Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. But why must it address agriculture in rural areas? Very simple. Because agriculture is the source of livelihoods of rural populations. And smallholder agriculture is what people live on in rural areas. Now, interestingly enough, in the developing world, these small producers are responsible for growing most of the food that is produced in developing countries. In some cases, up to 80%. It is their lifeline, not just for food alone, but for jobs and for income. And I believe that the good news today is that there are prospects which look brighter than ever. There will never be a shortage of demand for food. So our job is to make sure that small producers have the tools to contribute to and to benefit from the supply. Ladies and gentlemen, now let me share with you what I consider as 3 requirements for success in agriculture and rural development. I think first and foremost, we have to recognize that agriculture, that farming, irrespective of the size or of the scale, is first and foremost a business, an enterprise. Even for a farmer who is growing 1/2 of an acre or 1/2 a hectare, she wants to make money. Why do I say she? Because in the developing world, women farmers are key. She wants to make a profit, no matter how small. And collectively, in the developing world, these small producers are the biggest investors in agriculture. They invest time, they invest labor, and whatever income they have on their farms. But when you think about it and when you analyze it, the needs of small producers are exactly the same with the large-scale producers in Europe and in North America. They have the same needs. So all farmers, large and small, rich and poor, they need access to inputs, they need access to financial services, they need roads to get their goods to market, they need processing and storage facilities because they want to sell when the price is best. They also need training, capacity building for livestock, for crop management. And they want to develop their skills to manage their farms. And of course, they need land rights. They need tenure to the land they farm. And they want access to water and to other resources. The same thing every farmer wants, but it's a matter of scale. Getting produce to markets is not a problem when you have good infrastructure. But in many parts of Africa, roads are so bad that farmers cannot even get their produce to the market. And there are no services when they need them. For example, electricity supply in many countries in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is a luxury. 1/4 of the population in sub-Saharan Africa has access to electricity, only 1/4, and so is running water. And that electricity does not run 24 hours. Sometimes it's just 2 hours a day, if they're lucky. I can give you many examples, but I didn't want to talk about IFAD today. But let me just share a couple of highlights of what we do to alleviate the difficulties that poor farmers face in the developing world. IFAD has invested in many areas, for example, in microfinance in Bangladesh, that help farmers to have better access to better seeds, higher production, and better prices. Biogas technology in China, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Tanzania that is providing cheap and clean energy. And this technology is so fantastic. 1 cow, 1 family. That cow allows them to generate electricity so they no longer cut down the forests, impacting on climate change. The slurry from the biogas is used to fertilize their crop, and they double their yields. So you can see that this simple technology, while increasing production and productivity, income for families, also helps them to contribute towards reducing the impact of climate change. Very simple. Or providing cheap and good infrastructure in Guatemala, India, and remote Pacific islands, or connecting farmers to markets like coffee producers in the highlands of Nicaragua that today are selling their coffee to buyers in California, or small farmers that have formed a cooperative in Guatemala and are now producing cut beans that gives this cooperative about $100 million a year, and their primary client is Walmart in Miami. Or coffee and cocoa growers in Sao Tome and Principe, a small island state in West Africa that is selling the best coffee and cocoa today in Europe, just by organizing them and giving them access to microfinance and new technologies, simple technologies. This is what it takes. Just $1 can transform the life of a family. It doesn't take $1 million to do it. I know it because I've seen it with my very eyes. The most exciting part of my career is when I travel to these rural areas in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, and you see people, real people in rural areas, how they are helping to transform our world. This now leads me to my second proposal. It is not enough to know the physical conditions on the ground. So the second requirement for successful development is to recognize that change cannot be imposed from outside. The change must respond to the needs and customs and cultural values of the people on the ground. Our colleague from the UNDP just mentioned it, the social dimension of development. To those of you who are students in this audience, whether you are planning a career as economists, as scientists, or as development experts, remember one thing: listen and respect the opinions of the people you want to help. Because these rural communities know more than you do. They may not have had the same opportunities as you in going to school and having the same level of education, but their knowledge of the land and of the local conditions is far deeper than that of the development workers who parachute for a few weeks, or a few months, and want them to change. These communities know what they need. What we should do is to help them to get it. Let me give you one example. I think this is an interesting one. It's in Timor-Leste. As you know, Timor-Leste is one of the poorest countries of the world. 2/3 of the population of Timor-Leste are food insecure. Their greatest problem is low crop productivity. So when the farmers were offered new seeds, new varieties of maize They hesitated. Why did they not want new varieties, seed varieties of maize? New varieties of maize seed. It will increase production and productivity. But they refused. Why? Because they lose 30% of their produce to losses, insect damage, rat damage, humidity. The problem was very simple. They had no storage facilities, simple storage facilities. So if I'd helped them, apart from providing better seeds, new varieties, we also helped them to build simple storage facilities. So they could grow more, store the harvest until it was the right time to sell in the market, not to sell immediately, because they could store them. And so through a combination of better yields and low post-harvest losses, they had more food and they made more money. So as I said, this illustrates an important principle. Development is not something that we do for people. Development is what people do for themselves. Our job is to listen, to give them the tools, and to help them create the right conditions. And this leads me to my third and final requirement for successful development. We must make sure the tools for self-development reach the hands of rural women, because we must focus on rural women. Why? Because when you invest in a man in the rural areas, you are investing in an individual. When you invest in a rural woman, you are investing in a community. I hope you have heard this message. I hope it is very clear. Because today is the International Day of Rural Women, in case you did not know it. And so we must make sure we understand the role of women and that we acknowledge it and that their voices are heard. Women make 43% of the agricultural workforce. They are, one, the primary caregivers in rural households. Two, when they make money, they are most likely to invest them in the community, in their families, and in food and health. When a man makes money, you know what he wants to do. He buys a bicycle if he doesn't have one, or he buys a motorbike, or he builds a new house, or in some parts of the world, he takes another wife. More than half of the improvements in malnutrition between 1970 and 1995 were attributable to improvements in women's status and education. But as we know, in rural areas, in most societies actually, women are treated as second-class citizens. They have no rights to land, even the land that they farm. They have no access to credit unless they have the permission of their husbands. And they do not even have the right to own equipment or to own homes. And this results in a higher rates of poverty for themselves and their families. So closing the gender gap is not just a woman's issue. It is an issue for the whole family. Ladies and gentlemen, it is true that the new development agenda is more ambitious than anything that has come before. We must rise to and embrace this challenge. It cannot be done by one person alone. It calls for partnership. Partnership of the public sector, of governments, partnership of the private sector and the business community, but most importantly, partnership with the communities themselves. We know that the international community has supported and is supporting the Sustainable Development Goals. But we know that for too long, development has relied only on overseas development assistance, ODA. But in the post-2015 agenda, we know that ODA will not be sufficient for us to achieve those goals, because to achieve the SDGs, it will take trillions of dollars. Yet ODA today is only $150 billion a year. So where is the rest going to come from? Institutions like IFAD are today exploring new avenues of financing for development, but success will depend on every partner playing their parts. Earlier today, in my discussions with Commissioner Mimichi, we believe that we already have the foundation for a stronger partnership between the Commission and IFAD. There are also today new sources of financing. These include foreign investments and higher domestic revenues. I believe personally that domestic revenues are going to be key in financing the SDGs. Yes, of course, there are financing from emerging economies, philanthropic organizations, and foundations. But domestic resources in developing countries are estimated at $7 trillion. But if these resources are to be of value, we need responsible governments that invest in their own people, with transparent governance and reliable institutions, governments that are accountable to their people and not to their own pockets. I believe corruption and other practices have decimated government coffers. That must change. We know that agricultural development does not need to be expensive. We have seen it ourselves at IFAD. Small interventions, like using bottle cap to introduce fertilizers to crops in the Sahel, makes a big difference. Farmers do not have to buy a 100-kilogram sack of fertilizer. We know that micro irrigation using flip-flops by recycling them in Madagascar can yield big returns. Finding the funds may, in the end, prove less of a problem than ensuring that rural areas receive the kind of investment. By this, I mean investment that is sustainable, investment that is productive, investment that is profitable for and inclusive of poor rural people themselves. It can be done. It must be done. But to succeed, we must measure our results not by higher yields alone, but by reduced poverty, improved nutrition, cohesive societies, and healthy ecosystems. Let me conclude. The world may look gloomy and in turmoil today. There are wars causing the disintegration of nations, communities, and societies. National economies of the North and the South are in deep trouble. The future looks bleak. I believe this is the storm before a bright day. What I witnessed in New York a few weeks ago was the dawning of a new era. The world came together as one, with commitments at the highest levels and a resourcing call to action. The message was made by heads of state and government, by leaders, by business leaders, by civil society. Our world is one world. Whether rich or poor, old or young, from the North or from the South, we are all in this together. We either float together or we sink and perish together. By working together and committing to Agenda 2030 in true partnership, I am convinced that we can build a world where the land is once more secure than the sea. Thank you.